kid back in 1977 when I was 14 years old. I came home from school one day and my mother told me she had caught a baby rosella in the backyard that was very sick. And I thought, that's interesting. And at the time, I had a small aviary with some budgies and finches and a pet galah in a cocky cage. And so I rushed to see this baby rosella that my mother told me she'd caught, and it was in fact a male scarlet-chested parrot that had obviously escaped from someone, since Eastwood is 1,000 kilometres away from the interior of South Australia where they're from. But even though it was quite sick from lack of food and fluffed up, I had it in a hospital cage for a couple of days. It recovered, and I put it in my mixed finch aviary, and then had to find a mate for it. So after selling a few zebra finches, quite a few zebra finches, to pay $30 back then for a hen scarlet, which was a lot of money, from Canary Island Pet Shop. Does anyone remember Canary Island at West Ryde? I know Peter Phippen did. I used to see him there all the time. So they didn't want to part with or split a pair, but I convinced them to trade however many zebra finches for $1 each for the hen scarlet. And I've had them ever since. And in fact, the normal line that I have to this day are descendants from those first birds. But the interesting thing is, even though I'm talking about establishing a mutation, I was never into mutations. I actually preferred the normal bird, particularly with scarlets. I thought you couldn't beat the normal scarlet. Why would you want to have mutations? But from having pairs of them for such a long time of the normals, I don't know how, but out of nowhere, from what I thought were a normal pair, looking in the nest box one morning, to my delight, I saw these two unusually coloured birds that ended up being two cinnamon hens, which, being a sex-linked mutation, means the cock must have somehow been split. Even though I bred him and I bred his parents and I bred their parents, for some reason this bird must have been a split. So I guess the first mutation has to come from somewhere, whether it's a albino kangaroo or whatever it is. The first one has to appear due to an altered gene somehow. So I am by no means an expert on genetics, but according to dictionary.com, the definition of a mutation is a sudden departure from the parent type in one or more heritable characteristics caused by a change in a gene or chromosome. Now, in the cinnamon mutation, the cinnamon affects the colour of the normal bird by preventing the conversion of brown pigment into black pigment, known as incomplete melanogenesis. So the cinnamon birds have absolutely no black or shades of grey at all on them, compared to other recessive mutations such as pastel or fallow, that you can always see a slight tinge of grey. And it is always sex-linked in inheritance. And I mention that because there is a lot of confusion in both parrots and finches as far as the naming of mutations. And the cinnamon term is loosely, any bird that seems to show a bit of brown on it, like say what we now know to be a dilute rainbow lorikeet. When they first came out, they were calling them cinnamons, but it's a recessive mutation. And then the real cinnamon turns up. So, we've got recessive cinnamons and sex-linked cinnamons, and you sort of see on PetLink people advertising, split hen cinnamon princess parrots. Well, they're not cinnamons if you've got a split hen. So, and then the real cinnamon princess parrot turns up. So that is sex-linked. So it does cause a lot of confusion. But the bird I'm talking about is definitely the true cinnamon mutation. And I promise not to bore everyone to tears talking about genetics and saying the word chromosome or gene too much. And as I say, I'm by no means an expert. But to try to say in layman's terms how the cinnamon gene is inherited, unlike mammals, all cockbirds have two X chromosomes and hens have one X and one Y. Now, the hen's Y chromosome is too small to carry any genes, including the normal wild-type genes that would oppose mutations carried on the X chromosome. So therefore a hen only needs one gene for a sex-linked mutation such as cinnamon to be expressed visually, but a cock needs two. And hens can only pass the cinnamon mutation to their sons, but cocks can pass it to both sons and daughters. So the daughters will always visually be cinnamon, but the sons will only be visually cinnamon if they inherit the cinnamon mutation from both their father and their mother, which is why it has taken me 6 years to breed the first cinnamon cock, but I'll get to that a bit later. So cocks come in three forms. They're either completely normal, split cinnamon, meaning normal looking but carriers of the cinnamon gene, indistinguishable from the normals, or visually cinnamon. So the hens are chalk and cheese. They're either 100% normal or 100% cinnamon. So at least you know what you're up for with the hens. And again, there is no such thing as a split female with the cinnamon mutation. So that isn't the best photograph in the world, but I included that one because it had a bit of natural sunlight coming through on the back, and it clearly shows the brown in the wing that I'm talking about. Unlike pastels or fallows, where there has been a reduction in melanin, but not to the extent where brown was just unable to be turned into black like that hen is showing there, compared to the normal bird or the split bird in the aviary next door. So that's a close-up of the normal hen scarlet on the left and the obvious differences with the cinnamon. That horn-coloured beak that I mentioned is retained at maturity. If I hadn't bred cinnamons, if I saw that bird at a sale, I would tell the person it's a young bird, that it hasn't got its dark beak yet, but mature hen cinnamons still have that pale horn-coloured beak and pink feet. And I'd like to mention this book, which I have found a Bible as far as genetics, not just, even though it's specifically colour mutations and genetics in parrots by Dr. Terry Martin, even though it specifically mentions just about all the parrot mutations, it's very relevant to finch people or other species as well. And it is really well written so that a layman like me can actually understand what they're talking about. My wife tells me that I didn't talk to her for a week after I'd bought that book. I've read it cover to cover 6 times. But the main reason I mention that tonight is I'd be interested in some of you Finchos' opinions on a comment Terry Martin makes in this book saying that fawn is the same mutation as the cinnamon mutation. And a species without any yellow family pigments, such as a zebra finch, has the fawn mutation, whilst others, like a canary or a starfinch, have cinnamon mutations. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with that. However, we do have fawn starfinches. So if it got down to only sex-linked finches being called cinnamon, or fawn in the case of a zebra finch, for example, with the white pigment rather than yellow, when does a cinnamon become a fawn or a fawn become a cinnamon? So it's an interesting one. Just putting a few pictures up there of some Aussie finches. Like, I know for a fact fawn zebras are sex-linked. I know for a fact long-tail finches are. The cinnamon star is, but what we are calling the fawn star currently is recessive. So Terry Martin would say we should rename fawn stars something different, but I would say try telling finchos that, or try telling Bruce Hockley that fawn zebras should be called cinnamon. It's not going to happen. But the interesting one, I think, just out of those Aussie finches, is the fawn painted finch, because the ones that we saw at Mike fiddlers. Most of you probably went to Mike Fiddler's place that day. I know they're a recessive mutation, being called fawn, but the ones that I saw at his place still had quite black on the sides, where I have seen other birds where it's more a chocolate brown. And Andrew from Andrew's Bird Palace assures me there are two totally separate mutations. That one he calls fawn as recessive and cinnamon as sex-linked. So maybe not now, but later on I would like some of you who know a lot more about painted finch mutations to either confirm or deny that, but it's definitely open for discussion. And the main reason I bring that up is just to, remind you have to be careful when you're buying different mutations, that you know whether you are getting a recessive mutation or a sex-linked mutation, or if someone's trying to sell you a hen that is supposedly split that is actually normal and so forth. Okay, getting back to the scarlets, it was 2010 that I discovered that I'd had these two unusual birds in the nest. I must admit that's not that photo wasn't taken in 2010, but I took a picture on my iPhone of two cinnamons in a nest from the same mating, which is a split cock to a normal hen. So in that nest you can actually sex the young before they even colour up. You know that those two cinnamons must be hens because the cock was a split and the mother was a normal. And the bird on the bottom left looks like a cock by how dark blue the face is, but he would be a possible split cock given that the father was split and the mother was normal. So only future test matings can confirm or otherwise whether they are splits. So that can be a very frustrating thing with the sex-linked mutation is I have to keep building all these aviaries to house these possible splits that you don't know if they are or they aren't until you breed them. And even if you have 3 or 4 nests of normals, does that mean that they're definitely not split? So, and because I was somehow carrying that gene in what I thought was a normal bloodline, I wonder how many normals I've sold to pet shops for $25 that are actually splits, and whether someone else has had these turn up in their backyard and they just don't know what they are, or they're disappointed that they're faded ones or something. So not being sure of exactly what they were, I figure they may have been cinnamon, but only future breeding would prove. I thought they may have been the dilute mutation like the yellow Turk, for example, or the dilute purple-crowned lorikeet. Or perhaps lime like you get in red rumps or some of the lovebirds. But I was pretty sure that nothing like this existed in Australia. I asked every dealer I knew if they'd ever seen them. I showed every parrot breeder I knew pictures of them on my iPhone, and a few people dismissed them and said, "Oh, they're just pastels, mate. What are you worried about?" I said, "No, trust me, they're not pastels. It's sex-linked, and they've got these brown feathers." I went along to the Aviculture Society's NEA-FEMA conference. When was that, Paul? 2012 or something? That Neil Ingram hosted, and I showed him pictures of them, and he said they were definitely cinnamons. But by then I had pretty much worked it out, proving that they were sex-linked from additional matings I did with possible split birds that proved themselves as splits, producing cinnamon hens from being mated to normal hens, and having no traces of grey or black pigment, and the chicks hatching with plum-coloured eyes, which soon darkened, meant that it was in fact cinnamon. So, as I mentioned before, comparing them to pastels, they're the 3 different flight feathers, the one on the left being the normal bird with the jet black flight feathers. The pastel, which has a reduction of about 50% melanin, as you can see, still has that sort of smoky grey colour compared to the cinnamon, where there's just no trace of grey whatsoever, and it's just brown. And I've actually had a few people, when I wrote an article in Australian Bird Keeper a few months ago and advertised the first ones I had for sale, and a few people rang me and said, "Oh, I've got those birds, there's nothing special about those, I've had them for years." And I said, "Okay, send me photos," and they sent me photos, and they're pastels with the grey wings, or there was one that was a hybrid Turk with a red shoulder patch, and it was like a yellow Turk or something. That's a cinnamon chick at 20 days old. You'll see how pale the feet are, and even in the nest, when they're only from a day old, a day after hatching, you can the telltale sign of a cinnamon is the white toenails, and if it's on its own or a normal on its own, it's not that noticeable. When you look at two siblings, a normal compared to a cinnamon, it's quite obvious that their toenails are just snow white compared to the grey colour of the normal bird. And at that stage, their eyes are, I wouldn't say red, but like, as I mentioned, a plum colour. But you can see that one's eyes have darkened up already. Okay, as far as the breeding expectations go, a cinnamon cock to a normal hen will give you normal split cinnamon cocks and cinnamon hens. But the good thing about that mating is you know exactly what you've got. You can sex them in the nest. There's no question about it. The only problem is, where do you get a cinnamon cock from when the only two in Australia are two cinnamon hens? So I was forced to do the normal cock to cinnamon hen mating, which produced normal split cinnamon cocks and normal hens. The next mating, which I find to be the most frustrating, is a normal split cinnamon cock to a normal hen. Now, even though 50% of the cocks are normal and 50% are splits, there's no way of telling those birds apart. So, as I mentioned before, it's just the test matings. You have to have room to store all these extra birds. At least you're going to get some cinnamon hens, and the normal hens are totally useless for future breeding of cinnamons. I call them seed eaters, the normal hens. I've got quite a few for sale if you want any. Then the normal split cinnamon cock to a cinnamon hen, in theory you should be breeding 50% normal split cinnamon cocks, 50% cinnamon cocks, 50% normal and 50% cinnamon hens. However, that mating, would you believe, last season I was really excited that I thought I must produce a cinnamon cock, or at least some more cinnamon hens out of this. I had that same normal split cinnamon cock to a cinnamon hen. They produced 7 young over 2 nests, and they were 5 normal hens and 2 split cocks. So it just shows you that those percentages are obviously over a very wide base. It's like, you could toss a coin 10 times, and in theory you should get 5 heads and 5 tails, but we all know you could get 8 heads and 2 tails, for example. But it's definitely not literal. But I remember selling a pair of white-breasted Gouldians to a guy once, and I said they're split white-breast. It's a recessive mutation. From 2 normal-looking birds that are split white-breast, you'll breed 50% splits, 25% normals, and 25% white-breasts. And I said, so you've got a 1 in 4 chance of breeding white-breasted Gouldians. And he said to me, in knowing my luck, I'll only breed 3. And he wasn't joking. He thought the 1 in 4 chance meant he had to breed 4 birds. So it's just, you have to take these things as they are meant. Obviously, cinnamon to cinnamon, you're just giving you 100% cinnamon cocks and hens. I haven't had the luxury of doing that yet, and because it's such a new mutation, I'm not sure whether there are any genetic reasons why you should not put cinnamon to cinnamon. I can't see why not, and we'll try it at one stage, I'm sure. Okay, just to give you some history, without boring you too much and going through every single year, from the records that I have of the leg ring numbers all kept in a spreadsheet, just so I can track who's split and who's possible and everything. 2011, I put the first 2 cinnamon hens to unrelated cocks and produced 4 split cinnamon cocks. Now, a lot of people a lot of friends have said, you're mad, you should produce them faster. Why don't you put the father to one of the daughters and speed up the process? But there are a couple of reasons I didn't want to do that. Besides the inbreeding when it was such early days, that pair were a reliable breeding pair that had had the 2 cinnamon chicks to start with, so I thought I'll leave well enough alone, chances are they'll breed some more. I was able to get one more from them before a hawk killed the original cockbird, so I'm glad I did have the 4 splits to continue with in 2012. So they produced 3 more cinnamon hens for me and 9 possible split cocks. 2013, I thought, okay, up until then I'd just kept it to normals. I didn't want to dabble and mix it with other mutations, just to, see how true I could, keep breeding them, and didn't want to sort of have birds with uncertain other mutations mixed. But 2013, I thought, okay, I'll try putting a white-fronted blue hen to a split cinnamon cock. And I got 2 cinnamon hens that are combining the recessive gene with the sex-linked cinnamon gene, so they're visually cinnamon but split for white front, and 2 possible split cinnamon cocks that obviously also split for white-fronted blue. So that same year, I figured, okay, I'm starting to establish it. I'm a little bit less nervous that it's not going to slip through my fingers and they're all going to die before it can get established. And because I'd heard so often of when people establish mutations that they either get stolen or they die out. I know in Mike Fiddler and Stuart Evans' Gouldy and Finch book, when he mentions mutation by mutation, who bred the first ones and whatever, there's a few that did exist in the 50s or 60s that we no longer have because, someone broke in and stole them all. So because I was worried about things like that, another breeder called Lex Raymond had shown some interest in them, and I gave him a split cinnamon cock on loan, if you like. Said, if you can do anything with it, we can share the offspring or whatever. And he was able to breed 2 cinnamon hens that he put one of my splits to a pastel hen, so he bred 2 cinnamon hen split pastel in 2013. 2014, another 4 hens, 4 split cocks and 5 possible split cocks. So you can see what I mean about all these possibles building up and then having to mate them all, which can be quite tedious. So you certainly need to be patient, that's for sure. 2015, the first cinnamon blue hen was bred from a white-fronted blue and a split cinnamon cock that was split blue. And Paul Henry was also able to help me out by taking on a split cock, which he put to one of his red front hens and produced 4 cinnamon hens in. That was in 2 nests, Paul? Yeah. And I had a nice red-fronted cockbird that was a possible split, and Paul has bred some nice hens and given me 2 of those back to expand my gene pool, and a nice red-fronted cockbird. That's the first cinnamon blue hen that was bred in 2015, just before she left the nest. I thought I'd better take a photo of it before it died, since it was the only one in Australia. But fortunately, she didn't die. The next year, she produced, drum roll, the very first cock cinnamon. So after 6 years, he finally appeared. So that's just showing you the difference between the normal cinnamon and the cinnamon blue hen. So you can see, as I mentioned, how the horn-coloured beak and the pink feet that never darken. And that's Paul's split red front cock to one of my red front hens. They are currently on eggs, so I'd be stoked if I could breed a cinnamon cock with a red front like that, but I can only dream on, time will tell. And cinnamon is yet to be combined with pastel or violet. What we in Australia call violet is not the true violet found in Europe. It's more the dark factor, which is available in a single factor and a double factor. That's a single factor of par blue violet on the right and a pastel par blue on the left. Now, the reason I mention those two specifically, cinnamon can be combined with any other mutations, but even though Australia only has a fraction of the number of scarlet mutations to the rest of the world, for some reason the pastel mutation has never appeared overseas. So when we combine cinnamon with pastel, they will be the first birds in the world of that colour. So I can only imagine looking at that pastel par blue cock on the left, if he already has 50% reduction in melanin but still has the grey, if that grey was unable to be produced due to the limiting factor of the brown in the cinnamon, I imagine it will be like, a white coffee-coloured flight feathers and a sky blue back, or a lot paler blue back, and the violet being probably like a more olive or a mustard colour. But that's imagination. Time will tell what they look like. But this year I've got a cinnamon head that's split pastel that I'm putting to a pastel cock to breed some pastel cocks that will be split cinnamon, and hopefully next year can produce that cinnamon pastel. So it's quite exciting times going forward. Okay, I just thought I'm not going to go into the whole set up and breeding and feeding and everything, but I thought you just might be interested in seeing the setup. I have the suspended aviaries on the left-hand side where I keep the scarlets. In behind was just a row of conventional aviaries with a walkway. And as I said, with all these bloody possible splits, I'm having to keep building aviaries. So I have been tacking on suspended aviaries at the front of the walkway and cutting doors into the back of it, so you've got aviaries on each side, and then I just keep extending to the left and to the left and to the left until I run out of room. So I'll have no backyard left soon. So that's a view from the front. That's in the walkway with the conventional aviaries on the left, and the suspendeds are on the right-hand side. That's the view of the conventional aviaries from the walkway, and then that's the suspendeds on the opposite side. So I find the suspendeds quite good. Some people say that because the scarlets are ground-dwelling birds, they should be, have an earth floor or be able to scratch around on the ground. But I find they're notorious for eating their own poop and picking up all sorts of things. So particularly when they're young in a holding aviary, they tend to eat each other's droppings rather than eat seed if you give them the chance. And the suspended aviaries I find are good for not only letting the most of the droppings go through and limiting the amount of work, but the food just falls through as well, which leads to another good problem with the food falling through, is I get double bars and redheads cleaning up the mess under the suspended aviaries. Some real birds, you say. Okay, that just about wraps up what I've done, so thank you, Jeff.